Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining our development dialogue on localization. Localization has become a really important area of discussion, and TIPS has been undertaking some research on this issue for the last couple of months, as well as historical work that we've been doing for a good couple of years now on tracking the extent of opportunities around localization. So today we're going to be talking about the different areas of work, and then we've got Dr. Tebogo Makube, who will be sharing his insights on this issue as well. Our first presenter is going to be Wanda Maseko, who's the senior economist at TIPS, and she'll be talking about the localization tracker and some of the issues that arise from there. Then we'll have Niva Makhetla sharing the research that we've undertaken, thinking through some of the key issues on localization and trying to take the debate forward. And then the insights from Dr. Makube, who, in addition to being the Chief Director of the dtic, sorry, that looks at the issues of designation. He's also chair of the TIPS board, and he'll be sharing his insights today. We're having it as a hybrid forum, so we've got people in the room, we've got quite a few people online. We are looking at this being the way forward in terms of how we do these seminars, so that we have people in person and online. It's convenient for people to come in online, but there's also the benefit of in person and being able to engage with colleagues while we're here. We'll have opportunity to have questions afterwards from both people online and in the room. And we look forward to some robust discussion happening online as we normally do in the chat, where people share their ideas and insights as well as questions they may have. And then we'll have some of the questions coming through from online for the presenters. In terms of where we are, sorry, I didn't introduce myself. My surname begins with an L, not an M, but the rest of everyone else is M, so I don't know if I fit in quite. But I'm Saul Levine, and I'm the Executive Director at TIPS, and I'm going to be moderating today's discussion. Just one or two words on localization. The potential of localization, the importance of localization, has seen it come to the fore as a key industrial policy measure, and is something that we have been seriously looking at in terms of how it can support jobs and it can support industrial development. But it does mean that we need to get it right. Part of our thinking and our research is how do we take those debates forward so that we can support an improved approach to localization, and that does require research, it requires debate, and it requires engagement, so that we understand the lessons from the past and we see the best way forward in terms of supporting our localization efforts. Let me now hand over to our first presenter, Wanda Maseko.
Thanks, Saul. Morning, everyone. So as Saul already indicated, I will be presenting some key findings from the Imports Localization and Supply Chain Disruption Study. And just by way of content, so I'll be looking at the aim of the report and the methodology that we use, as well as just some of the key questions that we try to answer with the report, and some key findings as well from the past reports, and then briefly looking at the implications for industrial policy. Just to preface this presentation by saying this is not a presentation of the actual report. I'm just highlighting some of the key findings. I think the best way is for you to actually check the report out on our website. It's not a long report and it comes out on a quarterly basis. Okay, so in terms of the aim of the report, as Saul already indicated, I think COVID led to very major disruptions in terms of global supply chains. And so when we thought of this report, we looked at where we could try to bridge the gap in terms of, what are some of the products that South Africa could look to localize, given some of the disruptions that we saw in supply chains. And so, I mean, the report itself contributes to the conversation by essentially trying to understand where there is potential for localizing particular products. And it does so by looking at, where this capacity for local production doesn't exist, should it be increased, and is it a viable option to look at? And just to also add this, which is that it's not a feasibility study. It's just an indication of how much demand there is for a particular product. And so I think a further feasibility study would then have to be done to figure out whether it is actually viable. This is just an indication of where some of the potential exists for local production based on some of the demand we've seen, just looking at the imports that are coming into the country. And then in terms of the methodology, so we use data that we use for the import tracker, which is another quarterly report that we do as tips. And here initially we started with the top 100 imports by rand value, but we've since expanded it into the top 200 imports by rand value, with the focus being on manufactured imports, The priority is then given to products that are inputs to, the production of high value exports. So like autos, for example, or, imports of final products that there's significant demand for with either locally or within the region. And just in terms of the numbers, we're looking at imports where on a quarterly basis, minimum is 150 million. But what we've seen so far is that most of the imports that are actually in the top 200 are in excess of 300 million. And then for the report, what we do is then do the data analysis, as well as some desktop research, and then where possible, we engage with companies. And just as a highlight, I think one of the biggest issues we're faced with the report is actually being able to engage with companies in order to establish, how much production is there locally. I think some companies are quite wary of sharing some of that information, but some of them have been open in terms of sharing that data with us. And then by way of trying to answer, some of the quick questions. So this is essentially then what we look at. And you'll see here, we classify products based on whether they've not previously been manufactured in South Africa, if they've been manufactured previously, but South Africa couldn't compete because of low-cost competitors, or if the products are made locally, but we've then seen, imports increasing over time. And so for this particular table, for example, we'd be focusing on one product. So let's say it's a t-shirt, for example, at HS8 level, will then be indicating it's currently made in South Africa, what's the rand value of the imports on a quarterly basis. And then some of the key questions that we try to answer as well is, what do we export in terms of the region? What do the numbers look like in terms of the values, in terms of the quantities as well? And then also trying to figure out, as I mentioned, domestic production capacity. Do we know the volumes? And as I've indicated, most of the times it's difficult to establish whether there's any production, or not so much production, but how much is actually produced locally. And also just facing issues of, is this product actually fully manufactured from scratch, or is it just a matter of assembly, for example? And as you'll see in the report, where we're able to, we also then try to indicate some of the factors, such as, is there a patent for this product? Are there any agreements with other countries or with other companies for the manufacture of these products? These are not always questions that we're able to answer, but we try as much as possible to answer them. And so having looked at these questions, I think let me just quickly go through what we've seen so far with the past reports that we've done. So we started working on this report in the first quarter of 2020, and we've done about 59 products so far, and that was because there was one product less in the fourth quarter of 2022, I think. And what we've covered so far is products in different sectors such as ICT, clothing and textiles, capital equipment, food and beverages, and there's other sectors that I didn't necessarily include here, but these ones that are included here cover most of the products that we've looked at. Most of what we've seen as well, these products tend to be consumer goods, but there are also some intermediate goods that go into other key industries like automotives or electronics and other such areas. And then just as a baseline number, when you combine the sort of quarterly value of these products that we've analyzed, it comes to about 63 billion rand worth of imports. And so it shows that there is actually high value there. And if there's any potential for localization at all, I think there would be major gains for South Africa. And in terms of, designation, I think what we've seen, again, we're looking at this at HS8 level. And so when we look at it, we find that quite a lot of the products that we've analyzed are not actually designated, but there are some that are designated, which tend to cover clothing and textiles. There's also products in steel, as well as one of the key ones which I've included on here, which are set-top boxes. Just quickly to look at, some of the key findings from past reports. Just to note here that I've provided this data on an annual basis, not on a quarterly basis, because I wanted everyone to be able to see what the actual total values per annum look like, rather than just focusing on quarterly basis. So these here are four products that we've analyzed in the past. And you will see that, in the early 2010s, imports coming into the country were quite high, but there was then a dip. And essentially now we're only seeing increases in some of the products, but not all of them. And these are capital equipment products as well as their related accessories. And what we've seen in the data is that South Africa is a net importer of all of these products, with the exception of parts and machinery for working mineral substances. Otherwise, South Africa is a net importer of these products. And most of them tend to come from Asia, so China, India, and then there's other products as well coming from Sweden. And much of what is exported from South Africa goes into other countries, which is what we've seen with quite a few of the products that we've analyzed. Generally, when we export, those products tend to go to other African countries. And in terms of these capital equipment products, especially the vehicles like the self-propelled mechanical shovels, for example, and the dumpers. So I think one of the biggest issues that needs to be highlighted here is that these tend to be, yes, high value products, but they're also low quantity products. And so in terms of local production, it raises questions of whether we can actually, as a country, reach scale for new entrants to be able to come in and join the local production force. Where we've seen high quantities is with the accessories, so parts and accessories, for example, where on a quarterly basis, you'd see imports coming in the millions of kilograms. But again, there's already dominant players in the industry already, especially with these kinds of capital equipment. And so to be able to increase production, I suppose we will need to figure out where are we producing for exports, or are we producing for the local market? And I'll come back to this particular issue when I get to the implications for industrial policy. And then the other key issue here in terms of capital equipment, I think we all know, is the demand for these products is necessarily driven by demand, or by, activity in other industries. And so if those industries are not growing, demand for these products is not going to grow locally. And so it requires exploration of markets outside of the country. And then the second group of products that we looked at was clothing and footwear. And these are then products that are 100% designated for local production. But what we've seen over the years is that actually, imports have continued to grow, and South Africa remains a net importer of these products, even as they are designated for local production. And one of the key things that this highlights is, I suppose, the limitations of designation as it relates to who is the product designated for. If it's for the state, then you can't expect designation to necessarily work for the private sector unless they commit to then manufacturing the products locally, selling the products locally and internationally. But right now, demand as far as it exists in terms of what is designated tends to be for the state. And so what we see then is that even though these products are designated, because the demand is not coming from the state, we still see quite a lot of imports coming in. And I think we all know that, the local clothing and textile sector has been decimated over the years. And so we're still heavily reliant on imports. Notably, though, especially with the clothing items, what we've seen here is that Mauritius and Madagascar have actually overtaken China as the main source of imports, although China still dominates in terms of footwear imports. And because these are consumer products, their demand there is obviously driven then by, consumer preferences. And then lastly, we also then looked at products in the ICT sector. And what we've seen, with the exception of the gray line, which is set-top boxes and routers, everything else has essentially sort of remained stable, except for maybe the processing units, which is the dark orange line. Interestingly here, where we see the surges in imports for set-top boxes, again, that's the gray line, it appears to have been driven by, demand from the state, which was when South Africa was supposed to migrate to, was supposed to do the digital migration. And so we saw quite a lot of imports of set-top boxes. It happens in 2015, which was when the deadline was, and then it happens again in 2017. And given the fact that the migration has not been completed, if there's no local production of these products, then we are likely going to see rising imports in the coming years as well. I think one of the key issues here that we then need to look at is in terms of electronics and ICT products. I think South Africa has missed the entry point for production. And so at this point, is it really worth it trying to establish, local production, or do we just cut our losses and move on? I will speak more to this when I go on to the next slide. Okay, so this is my final slide, and this was just looking at, the implications for industrial policy. And one of the key ones that I raised earlier was that most of the products, if not all of them that we've analyzed so far, exports tend to go to the rest of the continent. Yes, there is demand within the continent, but when we look at the share of exports that go to the continent, I think it's, around 10-ish% or so? I can't remember the exact number, but it's relatively low. And so if we're going to industrialize and build industries, I think we need to think clearly about where the demand is coming from. And as I've said, so far what we export, especially manufactured products, go to the rest of the continent. is this an intentional thing, or is this a question of local producers not being able to compete at a global scale outside of the continent? I think that's a question that we need to answer, and it is probably answered somewhere. And as I've said, given the limitations of the African market in terms of the values and the volumes that are exported, do we then want to, address some of the barriers and figure out why exports to the continent are not growing, or do we want to then explore, other markets? And as I said earlier, for certain products, South Africa has already missed the boat. But when you look at some of the supply chain disruptions that we've seen, is it worth it for South Africa to actually say, maybe we should try to build an industry, especially for products that support other key industries? And we saw this with semiconductors, for example, where there was a global shortage. There were issues around, actual transportation, having these products go to other countries. And it resulted in disruptions across different industries like automotives, across ICT. And as a country that has an automotive sector, is it worth actually exploring producing some of these things locally to be able to support those industries and then be able to export? And then lastly, just something I think is worth thinking about is how do policy makers then decide, which products to support for localization? Because I think at this point, there's a lot of products out there that are manufactured, but how do we decide, which products are worth actually supporting in terms of fiscal space for the country? And where can we use tools such as designation to support localization efforts in this country? Also keeping in mind some of the demand limitations for South Africa as well. I mean, we are generally not a big country. Demand is not as large as we would like it to be. And surprisingly, that's part of the reason we don't really produce microwave ovens. We don't have demand in this country. And so those are some of the things that we need to think about. I think obviously thinking about fiscal space, it would be unrealistic to say, no, the state must support different industries to localize. And so where can we get them for back? And I think Niva's presentation is going to try and answer some of these questions. But I think these are some of the issues that I wanted to discuss for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Nokwanda. I think you've given us a lot of useful insights. And what your research clearly indicates is there's a lot of products where there's domestic demand. We have industrial capacity, but we're not always matching the two. And so it raises questions, as you say, of competitiveness and areas to opportunity for us to grow. Niva Makgetla is going to be presenting her take on these issues, and we'll pick up on some of the complexity that we see in localization. So over to you, Niva, who is presenting online.
Apologies for being online. This is based on a paper that is also available at our website, which is trying to reflect a bit more on some of the issues on localization and how we think about it. Okay, so, first, I think it's important that we're clear about localization because it's often simply equated to import substitution industrialization, which of course we all learned at university was a bad thing. Anytime there's that kind of consensus in economics, you have to wonder if it's accurate. So basically localization is saying we need to replace imports of intermediate and capital goods used for export production and infrastructure, as well as final consumer products. And that the instruments to do that, as Nokwanda kind of indicated, is not only tariffs, but also changing public and private procurement systems, and at the same time addressing supply side problems that make our local industries unable to compete without explicit support. The logic is that South Africa needs to diversify away from commodity dependency. So, more than half of our exports are still mining products and metals, and agriculture then adds another 10 to 15%. but in this logic, emerging local producers can only become competitive if they have local demand and they're able to compete on cost. And the reason you need local demand is because virtually every new industry in the world has, I know LaQuanta said maybe we should export-oriented systems, but the fact is every country that is industrialized has had extremely high tariffs before they became major exporters and manufacturers. So I think that there has to be a degree of local demand where you have a bit of a safe space in order to become competitive. But I think the difference between the countries that have become major exporters and those that have, just seen high costs from import substitution industrialization is that the ones that became competitive, as Ha-Jun Chang points out at length, also had incentives in place to make people look at ways to cut their costs. So in this view, imports indicate demand, but there's a risk of a vicious cycle where because we're importing, local producers can't get into the market before they become competitive, so they never become competitive because they don't have demand. And again, the difference from, hang on, let me move this thing. The difference from a classic import substitution policy is firstly, it's not just focusing on final consumer goods, it's absolutely looking at inputs to products that we export, which is very largely auto, but also capital goods for the mines, as LaQuanta pointed out. And also the tariffs are not the main instrument. Rather, there's this focus on local procurement by the public and private sectors, which means that you have, firstly, an increased role for government departments, retailers, and downstream manufacturers. And you look at the master plans, they're all expected to play an important role in bolstering demand for local manufacturers. But it also raises the issue of what you do if along the value chain, some people are capturing rents. So we want local production of steel, but if that means Kumba is capturing rents on iron ore, then we may be just building in inefficiencies that reflect the problematic structure of our economy and our markets. I think it's important to say, it's easy to say, why don't we just do localization? But as LaQuanta kind of implied, we need to think about what are the actual blockages and address them, because otherwise, obviously, it won't work. So the most obvious thing is, what do we do if the local product is simply going to cost more? And in effect, we're saying, how much are we prepared to pay to support infant industries? But firstly, a big problem is that nobody ever publishes the actual price premium. They just talk about it, but nobody actually knows how much it is, if in fact it exists, because there are clearly cases where there is no price premium. The price premium can be a function of different things, and the impact of the price premium can also vary by the product, and that also makes this a difficult issue to answer. I don't think you can answer it in the abstract. So the cost is partially a function of the time required to catch up. So if it's going to take, 20 years for a South African producer to become competitive, then obviously that's a bigger cost for society than something where they can catch up in a year. But also there's the issue of the production costs. Can they actually come down? And the quality. So very often people say we want to use imports because we think the quality is better, but it's sometimes quite hard to pin down exactly where that quality differential exists. There are, however, external benefits to localization that for many companies, like in steel, they say they would pay a 10% tariff because they feel that it's worth it to have the faster delivery, that they're able to get tailored products when they need them. Obviously, also there's job creation and there's long-term industrialization. These are the things we classically set off against that cost where there's a price premium. But there can also be negative externalities if buying local reduces access for some people. The impact depends a lot on the product. If it's a necessity, if it's something we need for the economy or for working people, then a price premium may have a bigger socioeconomic impact than one that just applies to luxuries or, very light goods like toys that substitutes are available, and it's not that critical. And what that points to again is that the incidence of localization varies by group. The price premium can be very immediate and concrete for government departments, for businesses, and for consumers. The benefits down the road can be much harder to see because they come from a more diverse, dynamic, equitable, and jobs-rich economy, as the minister would say. And often those benefits are hard to see and hard to link back very concretely to the localization policy. And what that really means is also you need risk management, because there's no guarantee that producers will ultimately become competitive with the imports. So we don't really know how long you will have to pay a price premium in many cases. And as always with risk management, the critical thing is to be clear about how long will we pursue this policy if it's failing. Do we just give up immediately? Then we never win. But if we wait too long, we can pay a very high price. The other problem, though, is that it means the government has to accept that there will be some failures. That sometimes they'll put the money in to promote local procurement, to address supply side blockages, and it won't work. This is a really hard thing to do in the current fiscal system, because if you have a project that fails, you're asked to account for it. If you don't do a project which is needed for national success, nobody asks you about it. And again, the real question is, when is it worthwhile to pay more for producers? Sorry, I should say this is a separate question. There are cases where you might want to pay more for a producer that will never become competitive in terms of price, again, because of these external benefits, or because you feel like, you know, for instance, job creation or a particular product that we need in South Africa is worth it, even if it's not reflected in the market price. So we tend to act like we should only fund them if they become competitive, but there may be cases where we would fund them even if they will never become fully competitive. Just to talk a little bit about the regulatory system, and particularly the procurement system, because obviously that's an easier thing to address than supply side blockages. And just to be clear, there is an assumption in the localization discourse that the procurement system is biased in some ways against local producers unnecessarily. And it's definitely true. We have seen tender specifications that effectively exclude local producers, for instance, by requiring a kind of material that's not available here rather than allowing substitutes that are just as good. I mean, I know we keep citing this, but it's quite shocking. There was a municipality that advertised for Timberlake shoes. Well, obviously we can't produce those locally, but we could produce shoes that were probably as good. Tenders often have very tight deadlines. If your local producer needs to gear up to meet that demand, and you say, but you have to produce immediately, then a large-scale importer can probably get the goods faster and easier, and you just effectively shut out local producers. Similarly, they may be hard to find, you know, it may be hard for producers to find the actual tenders. There's like over 200 state agencies that put out tenders, and for any one company, particularly a small manufacturer, to find a particular tender is often quite difficult. And then again, procurement of many products, but particularly consumables, are split across departments and they're not predictable. That makes it very hard for someone to say, I'm going to invest to supply government when I have no idea how reliable that demand will be, how many tenders I'm going to have to go for. I may never get up to scale, even if government procurement as a whole would sustain local production. A new problem, particularly that they've kind of said with the new procurement system, the new preferential procurement regulations, there are no specified points for local procurement. Departments just each make up their own mind. Again, this makes the environment for producers less predictable. And it's really effectively saying we as government don't feel we can prioritize localization over other aims. And there are trade-offs. So if you have 20 points and the importers are Black-owned, or they're based in a township, or they're small, but the local manufacturers are not empowered, how do you decide which one should get the deal? And if we're basically giving departments explicitly, we're giving them no guidance at the moment. A third set of problems is around the capacity of the procurement officers, supply chain managers. They don't know if a product is imported or not. So they can't even track whether they're relying more or less on imports in many cases. We don't have a recognized methodology to show that the benefits of local procurement outweigh the costs in specific cases. So the individual procurement officer basically has to go out and make that case on their own. And that obviously raises the risk that people will say they got it wrong and then they get attacked. And then finally, the way the procurement regulations are written up, but also the fact that supply chain managers are not set up to do industrial policy means that it's very hard for them to support suppliers and coordinate with suppliers in many cases. And then last, but by no means least, there's a problem that when there is a price premium, departments have to pay for it from their own budget, even if industrialization isn't part of their mandate. So if you go to the Department of Health and say, you should pay a 5% price premium on medicines. They will say, but then we can get 5% less medication. That's 5% less medicines for patients who need it. It's almost impossible for them to justify that. Their job is not industrial policy. Their job is to provide patients with healthcare. So some ideas in terms of improving the procurement system. We need more consistent engagement between the DTIC and supply chain managers in the public sector in order to ensure that there's adequate notice of procurement, in order to try and consolidate demand so that producers have more reliable demand, and to coordinate localization measures with supply side support so that we ultimately do end up with industries that become more efficient over time rather than just, protecting the market for them. And I would argue part of the problem is we don't have this kind of platform between the people who do industrial policy and the departments who do procurement. So, basically, as far as I can tell, they pretty much meet in cluster, or they have, periodic meetings, but they don't have a platform where they can talk through their procurement plans, supply side plans, and try and come up with a match. We really do need stronger guidelines so that we don't have these funny things like specifications that just rule out local suppliers or timelines that are unnecessarily tight. What could we do there? Well, we could have firstly guidance on how to do specifications. Often people just copy from something else without even realizing how exclusionary they're being. The DTIC could have a database of suppliers. We could have a hotline where companies or unions that are affected can call in. There may be others. I do think we need to say more explicitly, we need to bite the bullet and say, how much are we prepared to provide points for local producers as opposed to other aims that we want to pursue with the procurement process? If we're going to do that, if we're going to put in targets, for instance, in annual performance plans for supply chain managers, then obviously we have to be able to track how much are we actually importing. And that requires all new systems, which is quite a complex issue. And I also think we need much more standardized cost benefit techniques and be much more transparent in the process about how much are the bids coming in from local procurers, how much higher are they actually? Because it's very hard to know if this is just a myth or if there really is quite a high premium in most cases. And again, that would require more transparency across the entire procurement system. And then finally, and I think quite critically, if there is a price premium, we need to meet it out of the industrial funds rather than departmental budgets. It doesn't work for DTIC to say to health, you can spend an extra, 10 or 20 million a year on some product, but we're not going to do it out of our budget. Either it's a priority for industrial policy or it's not. And then finally, just a very short summary assessment of some of the costs and benefits of localization. The benefits are most directly, you get more revenue for local producers. Hopefully that leads to greater production and job creation. Over time, companies consolidate, they're able to improve their competitiveness and move up the value chain. That promotes faster, more dynamic growth in the long run. In other words, if you think industrialization is the way to drive growth, this is clearly an important tool in the toolkit, particularly if we assume that as companies consolidate, they do in fact become more efficient. It would promote R&D that is geared more to domestic and regional needs, and we would have shorter supply chains, which makes it easier for people who are using these goods to get the products they really need on time. But there are costs, again, and the costs are, firstly, the consumer prices may be higher, and access to government service might be more limited, because that's the way it plays out in terms of government procurement. How do we as a minimum, we'd have to say, not only do the benefits outweigh those costs, but ideally, not just ideally, but in South Africa critically, because we're such an unequal society, we'd have to say, how do we ensure that moves to localization actually end up having a progressive impact in the sense that they help equalize household living standards rather than just hitting at poor people who can't get around them. So for instance, we've got very high tariffs now on poultry, which is the staple food for the poor, much higher tariffs on poultry than on red meat that only the top 10% of the population eats. Does that actually make sense from a socioeconomic standpoint, even if it does mean it sustains our poultry industry? A second cost, which is, I think, less of a problem in most cases, but might be in some cases. We're not going to get sort of cutting edge and branded products from a global standpoint. To some extent, that might offset the growth in local R&D. And of course, part of the cost is you do have to provide support to producers to overcome supply side constraints, incentives, infrastructure, skills, all of those things to build up a new industry are part of the cost of localization. You can argue there may not be much opportunity cost if we get the industries right, because we would spend that money anyways. And then finally, the risks, local production may fail, or it may never become as competitive as imports. And so you can end up, if you're not careful, you just have a higher cost economy that becomes less and less competitive. That is, of course, the argument that was made about import substitution industrialization, but it is a real risk. If you're not careful about this, the costs do mount up. Another risk that I would argue we've seen in practice is that we end up with measures in the name of localization that effectively protect upstream rents, so rents to commodity producers, and also increase the cost on basic necessities because producers are able to lobby for local various kinds of protection and local procurement at the cost of consumers and downstream manufacturing. Something we've seen recently with solar is you have to decide if we need a good urgently. How long do we wait for local suppliers to gear up? How do we get that balance right between the delays in getting a good or service that we actually need urgently and the time required to produce it locally? And then finally, just a flag, and we saw this with some of the infrastructure procurement. Once you start saying that price is not the only issue in state procurement, there is a risk of corruption. And I would argue that's unavoidable anytime you're trying to transform your economy, where you take it away from a market decision, but the fact remains it's something that has to be managed. So, thanks, all.
Thank you, Neva. That was an insightful presentation and draws out a lot of the complexities in trying to get us localization right and a better understanding of the risks that we face with localization, but also many of the opportunities and what we need to think about if we want to get this right. Let me hand over to Dr. Tebogo Makube, who's going to share his insights as the discussant.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity. I was not sure whether to prepare a presentation or just to come and talk as a discussant. But I've prepared some notes there. Again, let me thank you for the opportunity. I think this is a very interesting topic for the country. Right? It's not just an academic discussion. It's at the core of economic development in South Africa. And there are ideological issues to be resolved. Next slide, please. So as a discussant, my role is to ask questions and open up the debate, right? So in the paper, I think rightfully so, Neva argues that sometimes there's a confusion between localization and industrialization, right? Are they the same? And because we use them interchangeably. The other issue is about policy instruments. So if you want to drive localization, which policy instruments are you implementing as a country to achieve that? Is the outcome the same as industrialization, right? But my experience is that we seem to be using the words interchangeably, and that is not correct. In industrialization, there are instruments, tariffs, including public procurement, and there you leverage public expenditure for industrial development. Now, the other part is the role of institutions, which it's also raised here. Is it only the DTIC that is responsible for industrial policy? So if the Department of Health is procuring pharmaceutical products, does that mean it's not responsible to support the production of pharmaceutical products in the country? That responsibility lies with the DTIC, and therefore the DTIC must find funding for that. Given that we are a country with the high burden of disease, so the demand for pharmaceutical product is also high in South Africa. So that needs to be defined, and clarified, and knowing that there are other pharmaceutical products which are being procured by provincial governments. What is their role, in supporting industrial development? So I agree that the issue of management and the application of certain policies in certain government departments, there are certain weaknesses in there. Sometimes the data there's no relationship between data management and policy management. We make policies which is not supported by data. The relationship between your procurement strategies and budget allocation becomes a problem. And there are also in South Africa the issue of intermediaries, who are there forensically. We have to deal with that. Next slide, please. I'll move quickly. So, localization for me, it's about leveraging both capital and operational expenditure for industrial development in the country. I mean, the state is the biggest buyer. But the other issue that we must also talk about is the role of the private sector in buying locally manufactured product. Because if you are to amplify demand, it cannot only be the public sector that is implementing that. And also it's not about the price, because my experience engaging the private sector has always been, what is the price? If the price is not competitive, we can buy it anyway, right? Just to look at the profit margins. But it's a problem if, in a country like South Africa where there's high unemployment. So we need to use those measures to create jobs and boost exports, because it's important to earn, the much needed foreign exchange in the country, and also address the issue of transformation. Black people must be included in the production side of the economy. That is also key. Next slide, please. So roughly on the data, as you can see, I think I'm speaking to the converted here, the declining manufacturing addition to the economy. It's a problem in terms of unemployment, because you can go to any township, rural areas, you find people not working. All right, so South Africa then must target manufacturing because the labor absorption rate in manufacturing is very high. We also have a problem of low GDP and high inflation, which is creating a problem. The other sectors in the economy are also affected. I mean, yesterday I was reading an article indicating that it's very expensive now to buy houses in South Africa, and the youth is taking longer to buy houses because the inflation is high. So we have to deal with that again with unemployment, which has been talked about. Now, my focus and where it's mainly in the public sector, is the biggest buyer in the economy. The argument is that we are not strategic in buying certain commodities in the country. procurement by itself, whether it's in the public sector or the private sector, it's about buying of goods and services, right, at an affordable price. But is price the only measure to deal with developmental issues? So you need different strategies to, in health, pharmaceutical product. What is our strategy to buy pharmaceutical products at a reasonable price, but also develop the industry? That's a trade-off to deal with. ICT procurement in South Africa. My argument is that we don't have a strategy to procure ICT, both on the software and the hardware. We spend a lot of money as a country buying software. Are we developing, youth to take advantage of the big global industry? I mean, if you look at the billionaires which have been produced in the last 15 to 20 years, they're mostly in the ICT sector. So we can't just say we are overlooking that. Continue. This one I won't spend time on. It is about the imports. What are we? I mean, again, I'm fascinated by number 6, pharmaceuticals. We are importing a lot of those, and I think we should also learn from our global partners, especially India and China, who have been able to turn the tide, in supporting the local manufacturing of pharmaceutical products. You can skip. Another challenge that we have as a country is that, your SOCs, besides corruption, they've also reduced their spending in the economy. All right. So the multiplier effect of that is that then your downstream or upstream companies then tend to be affected because they don't get the opportunity to supply the SOCs, and is the case in the rail sector, which TIPS has done a study some years ago. The regulatory and economic impact, again, is that if we focus more only on the price, we will be losing on other economic variables, which are also equally important to drive development in the country. We have dealt with cement, for instance, when we designated cement for local production at 100%, were threatened to be taken to court by certain manufacturers who are importing products or the inputs in the country. All right. But what we have seen that time in 2021, that there was a spike in the importation of cement in the country. Now, that displaces the local manufacturers of cement. Now, if we don't have the strategy, then you have the importers, intermediaries in the system who are not adding value to the economy, but supplying the same. The issue that we are raising around clothing and textile, KZN and the Western Cape, where most of the manufacturers are located. So if you don't have a support system for them, we are going to lose jobs then. Continue. I just want to rush in terms of what we are going to. Okay, as an example, what we have seen since the 2017 Preferential Procurement regulations were ruled invalid by the Constitutional Court, and now with the new 2022 regulations, which do not necessarily directly support local procurement, is that organs of state are busy developing their SCM policies. And this one is the Preferential municipality in the Western Cape, which is indicating that there are no local content requirements. So go back to the question I was raising, what is the role of institutions? Is it only the dtic and others don't see the importance of supporting jobs and they come up with their own indicators, like allocating point to people residing in a particular municipality, which is more important than supporting jobs. So we must deal with that. Next slide. Same with what we are seeing is that the gender as a variable is elevated in the current system. So we are anticipating that there might be fronting, because if we want to get an opportunity to get more tenders, we have to have more women, without necessarily them playing a role. But moving forward, and this is the last part of the presentation on the public sector, it's the bill, which is now in Parliament, has put an emphasis on, developmental procurement policy, which must support innovation, investments, and promote sustainable development. So those are now found in the primary legislation. It's going to be interesting as to how we are going to support innovation through a tendering system. Innovation by very nature, it's novel, it's new. So you can't expect people to bid on something that is new and risky. So the system and the regulations must respond to how we deal with innovation, because innovation is also key for localization. And there will be trade-offs, especially when it comes to issues of sustainable environment, which is now in the bill. And others, we can skip that and go to. So that's what you find in the bill. The other issue that we have to deal with is the green economy. All right. How are we going to procure that? Besides the renewable energy, we have to deal with, recycling, water management issues. Are we capacitated to develop new industries as a country? Because those are critical. That's so on the way forward, there must be regulations to support localization in the country. At least the primary legislation is now covering that. But the other issue that we must deal with, as we are restructuring the network industries, electricity industries, particularly generation, is being restructured in the country. We now have players coming in, private players. The same is going to happen in the rail sector. All right. Is public procurement sufficient to drive localization in those areas, or you need other instruments, your incentives to encourage private players to buy from South African manufacturers or also manufacture in the economy. What is the role of taxation? What is the role of fiscal policy in supporting industrial development? Are we there? Because if public procurement is going to be limited in a restructured environment, you need other instruments to drive and deepen industrialization in the economy. And my argument is that then it's about time we look at the fiscal policy. We also look at the role of taxation in supporting industrialization. Other instruments which are very important is the role of technical regulators. Because if you want to manufacture and also export, you need to comply to international standards. So the issue of standardization of product is also critical if we are to make an impact when it comes to localization in the economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tebogo. And thank you to Nokwanda and Neva for your insights and your presentations. Lots of issues being thrown out there. Let's take hands in the room and online. We'll do 3 questions online, and then we'll give an opportunity to people in the room to ask questions or make comments. If you can introduce yourself when you talk, and also keep it not to a presentation, but also just to a short comment or question.
Thanks, and thank you to all the presenters. This is a seminal and important subject. I just wanted to point out that it's not, it's not only state procurement that we can leverage for localization. It's also all forms of state licenses and rights. So, like, what are we doing about water rights when we give water rights to farmers? Where's the localization in that? Finally, ICASA is starting to do it. Initially, for 20 years, the EM spectrum rights weren't being leveraged for localization. Then we have mineral rights, which aren't being leveraged because of the Chamber of Mines court case that the whole thing needs to be reconfigured. And then there are, the other rights, like if state land is leased, are we leveraging that? That's my first question. My second is that everyone has mentioned how our limited market is a constraint. Is that if we're going to have localization in the form of local content, shouldn't we be recognizing regional content in terms of trying to, as the flip side of accessing the regional market, which is around the same size as our market? So it would, SADC would double our market. How do we engineer that we work together? I know that Zambia is putting in local content in mining, for instance, and has in other areas. But that excludes any content from, say, Tanzania or Zimbabwe. So those are the 2 questions. Is 1, state rights, how do we leverage them? And 2, how do we how do we harvest the regional market? Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. We'll go to Chantel.
Thank you so much, Chair. My name is Chantal Strauss, and I'm from the Department of Small Business Development. I've worked with the DTIC before, and so what we're responsible for is value chain support, as well as the SMME-focused localization framework, which we developed in 2020 and got approved by Cabinet. Just a few questions and some answers. There's been a lot of, I think one of the points that, what's her name? Neva raised earlier on rent seeking is quite important, because we've had designated products in South Africa. However, I was talking to a guy yesterday when I was getting my battery fixed, and he was talking about the battery manufacturers in South Africa, where batteries have been designated and we're technically not allowed imports, but that doesn't ever go down to the small businesses, because the bigger companies within the association tend to, control the price. And I think that rent seeking is something that we need to get rid of if we're really going to make localization work. Another thing around institutional arrangements is that what's worked for us as a department is working with the private sector. Localization needs to be private sector led, because if you are coming as, government and saying, okay, we don't know what the demand is. So from our side, we've been working with Clicks, with Dis-Chem, with ShopRite, as well as other retailers and wholesalers, on what do you guys think can be localized more, better, and how do we support those industries? I think there are a lot of industries in South Africa that can be localized. And for me, the biodiversity sector and bioprospecting, as well as our wildlife economy. That's where the crux of the matter lies, because as South Africa, our competitive advantage is our biodiversity. And if we can actually commercialize that and capitalize on that, there are so many other sectors that can benefit. I mean, tourism can benefit. Pharmaceuticals and nutraceuticals is another area. But it also starts with government taking a tighter stance when it comes to tariffs, and also the monitoring, of these regulations and making sure that the big companies are complying with it, because otherwise, at the end of the day, it's the SMMEs that suffer. Thank you, colleagues.
Thanks very much, Chantal. Over to you, Rod.
Thanks very much, Paul. I'm Rod Compton. I'm with the African Energy Leadership Centre at Wits University. So my question is to Neva and the representative from dtic. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. As we know, we have a state of electricity emergency in this country, and we need to spend about 200 billion on grid expansion to partially resolve this crisis. Because of the current local content prescripts, it's costing us 40% more to expand the grid than it would if we were in Namibia, for example. So the first question is this sensible? And the second question is, no one has mentioned procedures or steps to remove unnecessary prescripts. And we know of several in rail where there are prescripts, things like train wheels which aren't even manufactured in South Africa and which can't be manufactured in South Africa because there's no steel available. There's no procedure for, in case of emergency or even in reasonable time, to remove these prescripts. What's being done to correct that? That's the second question. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Rod. We'll take Virgilio, and then we'll give our presenters an opportunity to respond. And then we'll take some questions in the room and then come back to those online. We have left quite a bit of time for discussion, so we still have another 20 minutes to try and get some of these issues debated and discussed. Virgilio, over to you.
Thank you very much, Saul. I'm Virgilio D'Amolo, Project Manager for Localization at Business Unity South Africa. I wanted to make a comment, but maybe a very quick reply to Rod, his comment about the Eskom transmission development plan and the cost. There's actually is not really clear how much it might cost more here in South Africa than Namibia. And there might be various reasons, and industry has already done some work on it to clarify why this might be the case. But I wanted to make a comment, maybe also questions regarding to public procurement, because I think there was one slide by Neva regarding the regulatory system, which was really capturing very well a couple of the key issues that we are facing in trying to make breakthroughs in public procurement. And one is the aspect of the specs. So how can we engage with the buyers in terms of specifications that are not penalizing local industry, and actually might be also an opportunity to actually find cost-saving opportunities through value engineering, all that. And the second aspect is about the timing of required to grow a local industry. So, for example, for the Eskom transmission development plan, we know local capacity at the moment is very limited, but can be built in a relatively short time frame. But of course, can only be built with some certainty of demand and some certainty of getting the contracts, because it would be very hard for any private sector company to invest, let's say, a couple billion for France to set up a new factory without any certainty of getting any orders. So I'm wondering also, given that the public procurement bill, and as Dr. Makube also mentioned, the regulations will then come with some of these aspects about engagement of specs and enough visibility and allowing local industry to create capacity could be somehow included in the new legislation. That's all. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. Let's get our panel to respond. We can go in reverse order. So we'll start with Tebogo, and then we'll take Niva, and then Nokwanda, you can finish off. And then we'll open up to other questions. Tebogo.
Let me start with the questions raised by Paul on the usage of other instruments like your water rights, land rights to leverage localization. I agree with him. That has been our argument that licenses can also be used to bring localization. The issue, though, is that we have to make sure that we are on the right side of the law, all right, because of litigation. In South Africa, litigation is very high. So if we use such instruments, we must make sure that we minimize the risk of government being taken to court. And also, we have reviewed what other countries have done, like India, when it implemented renewable energy, it was taken to the WTO. So we are mindful that on the international trade law, particularly the trade-related investment measures, that there is a limitation on certain instruments that you can use, particularly when it comes to private sector investment. But in essence, that is doable, and we support it as a department. The other issue around the localization at regional level, I've engaged with Zambia. It visited us on when it wanted to come up with the policy on localization. Our view is that the AFCFTA must also start considering policies on localization and leveraging of public expenditure. That has not been taken up as yet, but is an opportunity at that level. It only makes sense to increase the market base. We are limited as a country, so it makes sense to be at the regional level, and we support that as well, and as something to consider. The issue raised by Rod Compton on the prescripts, particularly with regards to the renewable energy, I'm not aware of any that are inhibiting progress, particularly in relation to localization. There was a challenge regarding the sourcing of locally manufactured panels at some stage. We have granted an exemption, but we also agreed that we will have to ramp up investments in the country, but not to delay service delivery. We have granted an exemption. So, and in our localization policies, exemption is embedded. So if the product is not available in the country, bidders can approach the dtic, and they are legally entitled for that. We have been tested in numerous occasions in the court of law, and the court has ruled in our favor that we are rational in refusing to grant an exemption when we have production in the country. Yeah. Lastly, on the other issue regarding standardization or rent seeking, I agree. There are incidents where there is collusion between certain bidders and the organs of state, where they will write specifications to support a particular bidder. It's an international issue. It's a challenge But working with industry associations, we always ask them that if there is an issue like that, they can approach us. And there are also certain instances where we've had requests for exemption on the basis that a particular product is not available in the country based on the specification, and we have refused to grant an exemption if on the basis that a spec or has been used to favor a particular manufacturer, but it's a limit and challenge that we have in the system.
Thanks very much. Neva, your responses?
So, yeah, I mean, the questions were very interesting. We clearly have many experts here. I mean, obviously, I agree with Saul that the point is with any industrial policy, you use whatever instruments you can. I do think the one thing about the procurement system is, it was never designed to promote local procurement, and I would argue it needs a complete overhaul. And that one of the mistakes we made was to say, we'll do it through the designation thing because it didn't require a big change in the regulations, but it's not also particularly fit for purpose, particularly for consumables. And it doesn't deal with things like, for instance, yes, you can get an exemption. I mean, you can challenge specs that seem too exclusionary, but it's not easy to do. There's not like just a single number you can call and there will be a response and they will really go into that tender and fix it in most cases. I think that Rod's point is really interesting, although I have to say, what I was trying to say with that cost and benefit thing is like with any SEAS, different groups bear the costs and the benefits. So you have to really be quite careful to test some of the claims. Having said that, I do think the energy transition is a classic case where if we can do the energy transition quickly and cheaply, that in itself is probably the most important thing we can do to promote industrialization in South Africa, because that's basic to every industry. At the same time, it is an opportunity to promote local production and getting the balance right between how long should we delay while local producers gear up, how much extra should they be paid, because there's a chance that we could really make this a major industry. Those aren't easy questions. And that's why I would argue, and so I don't know if you want to add on this, but this issue of how do we think about risk management in the state? I mean, right now we're just basically risk averse. But on industrial policy, we sometimes take chances without any way to get ourselves out of a hole if we got it wrong. And I think coming up with much clearer risk management systems there is very important. There are, by the way, you can totally do exceptions under the old designation system. I don't even know how much of that remains now that they've said they won't do designations going forward. And then the one thing I want to do is just make the point, because I do think we need to be careful with localization. And that's why I think it's important to think through the costs as well as the benefits. That sometimes you make it seem like the people who support localization want it at any cost. And it has become, it has kind of opened the door for people to just lobby for tariffs whenever they feel imports are too high, without actually, themselves committing to finding a way to reduce their costs and within a reasonable time frame. And I think we need some way of managing, again, how do we think about those costs and benefits? How do we decide when the benefits of having cheap imports actually outweighs the cost, the opportunity cost of not being able to maintain our own producers, but also vice versa? When do the benefits of cheap imports, firstly, they may not be there because in many of these cases, there won't be a price premium if we can get the procurement system right. But also the benefits of industrialization of local products that are more suited to what we need may well in some cases outweigh the costs. And I mean, the classic example is obviously vaccines, or the most recent one. How much more should we pay to produce vaccines locally? How much are we prepared to pay as a country to have locally produced vaccines, given that those are life-saving necessary products? How much can we pay to produce them locally? I think that's the kind of issue. It's not so much to say we have to grapple with it because it varies case by case, but we need systems that can deal with these things rationally on a case by case basis. So we don't just either give in to lobbying or refuse to act when it's something that would actually be beneficial to the country. Thanks.
Very much, Neva. Nokwanda, more insights.
So I think, I mean, most of the questions, all of the questions have been answered, but I think what I wanted to add was, I think we need to think clearly about, you know, what exactly is worth localizing. And I know because it seems as though every time we have this conversation, we add more products to possibly localize. And so we never get to a point where we make a decision about what's worth localizing and what's not. And I mean, I think I understand the state being a big procurer, right? And I understand that there's certain things that are needed there. But again, I think when you look at some of the data that exists, especially with some of the consumer goods that are out there, I think if we're just going to focus solely on what the state procures, then we're going to be missing part of the consumer market that's not part of the state, right? And so I think a decision then that we need to make is what is more valuable? Can we depend on the state to continue to drive demand for years to come? Or should we then start to think about what are households actually consuming? And some of those questions, as I noted earlier, I mean, it's a bit complicated because when you look at household demand, for example, with something as small as a microwave oven, how many times does a household buy that? And is that enough to actually sustain demand over a long term? But yeah, I think, as I said at the start of what I was saying now, I think the focus right now should be on what do we actually want to localize. I think you know, there's something else that's been added now, biodiversity and whatnot. And I think we never get to a point where we decide as a country, this is what we should focus on. It seems as though for the next 5 years, we're going to be having this conversation about, you know, what actually works best to localize. And on the issue of, I mean, the price, I think as Niva and Dr. Magube have also pointed out, we need to be able to decide as a country, is the price actually worth paying? And is it not worth paying? So when you look at vaccines, you look at especially pharmaceutical stuff, yes, we've seen some of the sort of, not assembly per se, but when you look at some of the ARVs that are produced in the country, most of what is necessary, like such as the APIs, for example, come from India. Can we actually get to a point where we manufacture that locally? I am not sure at this point. And so is it worth it for South Africa to say we have a pharmaceutical sector that produces ARVs when the only thing we do is package the product? And I think lastly, I think we need to be able to make a decision around, do we want to focus on high-tech stuff or do we want to focus on the low-tech stuff? So when you look at, again, medical goods, for example, do we want to keep manufacturing needles or syringes, or do we want to go for the high-tech stuff? Where is the value? Where is most of the value? And how can we actually reach that? As I already said as part of my presentation, I think some of these products we missed the boat on. And so I think we need to be honest as a country in making the decision about what's actually worth pursuing and what's not worth pursuing. Thanks all.
Any hands in the room? Questions? Okay. If you want to introduce yourself, please.
Okay, my name is Rafael Dichaka. I'm from the dtic. I work with Dr. Tebo. I think my question is more to the first presenter, Dr. Novan. So, did you, in your analysis, consider more in terms of some strategy in terms of the art of attracting the foreign direct investment in the country? Because everything is in terms of trying to amplify the demand. And wherever we go, we sit with our stakeholders who are mostly the investors, the company. So they always highlight the fact that our market is a small market. They cannot bring enough investment and whatever. So maybe my advice would be in terms of your data that you are collecting and analyzing, is to include, as Paul was talking about, the regional mandate. Because we must move from this concept of an economic autarky to the economic powerhouse role that the country must play, because we are still, I think, in the month of BRICS, and what is expected of us is that as a BRICS country, we must deliver. And one of the things that we must deliver as an economic powerhouse will be the industrialization, as Dr. Tebo was talking. Remember, in his first question was, are we going for industrialization or for localization? I think localization will become easy if we find some strategy that can really activate the industrialization in the country. And see, in terms, one of also of the question, maybe you have to check and see how can also, as a country, we can participate in terms of global value chain. Because you just ask the question now that, okay, are we going to produce higher value stuff or low value stuff? This will assist also to be a hub of production if we consider what products as a country we can participate in terms of global value chain.
Thank you.
And the last one is, if we can also think about in this securing this demand, regional demand, because we have issue with import. While we are in the BRICS country, can't we negotiate and see, okay, where we have the capacity as a region or an economic powerhouse? So other economic powerhouse like China, India, and others should refrain themselves to come and import because we are one family in terms of competition.
Thanks. I've got Antoine here.
Good afternoon, Antoine. Maybe a comment or observation in terms of the recent BRICS summit. Just at face value, it sounds like it's contrary or going the opposite direction as what we discussed today in terms of localization. We're very excited about the Chinese trade. But if you look at the trade, we are the little brother in that whole trade agreement, and we're really a net importer. And we don't benefit from that. We export all our jobs, all our businesses. There's a lot of anti-Western sentiments around it. It's actually really help us. If you think about localization, you need to not only focus on local demand, but you need to look at exports as well. That flies into our face. The new members that's been added to BRICS doesn't really add to what we export to. You have products that goes there, and likely in the future that will support any localization drives. Maybe just comments from the presenters. Thank you.
Any other hands in the room? Okay, I've got one last hand from Sandile, who's online. Sandile, do you want to talk? And then we'll do one last, then there's one other hand as well, and then we'll close the questions and allow the presenters to respond and also to wrap up. Sandile?
Thank you. I'd like to find out how can we build a transversal approach to our industrial policy adoption by both public sector and private sector, because the master plans that we see being developed by private sector, by a large extent, there's very little influence or contribution from local governments towards those master plans. And there's very little understanding by the public sector on some of the key value chains that could potentially provide opportunities where we could identify localization opportunities and existing capacity and technology. There obviously needs to, and I noted comments earlier on, that industry should drive those discussions, but there needs to be coordinated efforts. As a city of Durban, eThekwini, we have been a country, and what we've noted is that every metro has got their own understanding of localization. Everyone's trying to develop their own industrial policy or localization policy. And in that particular process, we're finding that we are not gaining the momentum that we ought to gain. And it's resulting in pockets of excellence. So what is the best approach in addressing localization from a policy point of view, as well as from an implementation point of view? Thanks.
Thanks, Sandy. The other hand is gone. Okay, so let's wrap up. I'll ask Nkwanda to answer her question and also give concluding comments. And then I'll mix it up. I'll go to Joel and then to Neva to round us up. Nkwanda.
Cool, thanks, all. Sorry, I didn't get your name. Raphael, to answer some of what you were saying. So, I mean, I think you raised an important thing there, which is to also look at the FDI. I would have included in my presentation that we look at a range of different items. And, you know, where possible, we also look at where some of the investment for production is coming in. It's something that we've done when we did the analysis for cell phones, for example, that have been that are potentially being produced in the country. And there was actually an international investor that came in. That whole operation seems to have or is going belly up. I'm not sure what's happening at the moment with Maraphones, but they were looking to set up a production process. I think there was a 1 billion something worth investment there. So I think when you look at the report, you'll see that we cover a range of different factors. And then in terms of let me go back to the last question because I missed part of the second question. Private and public, how to leverage that. I mean, I think part of what we suffer from as a country is the Americanization of some of our system, where we have national government, but it seems as though each province has, its own laws and legislation and so forth. And so I think part of what there needs to happen is for national government to be able to actually clearly communicate with provinces in terms of what the actual law of the land is. And I understand because I had a contact from eThekwini contact me and they were saying they're working on, a localization strategy. For me, the question is, how are you working on a localization strategy when there should be a national one? And so, I mean, I don't have the answer, but I think what needs to happen is probably better coordination across national and provincial government. I don't know if that's happening right now because I'm not obviously in the room. I don't know how to better do that coordination. Maybe Dr. Makube has an answer for that. But yeah, I understand why there would be pockets of excellence. And so what that will result in is what we've seen so far, which is where most of the investment coming in is in Gauteng, and it's as if some other provinces don't exist, right? Because Gauteng is obviously where national government is located and so has the benefit of being close by. And so I think that needs better coordination. What that looks like, I am not sure. I missed the BRICS questions. I'm just going to move on.
Tebogo?
Thanks. The issue raised by Stiano here, I think it's a very important issue. Look, it's not only BRICS. There's also the AFC, FTA, right? There is SADC. We must decide what we want. They are all promising, but the reality might be different, right? And for me, the focus on regional unity is important, right? Import substitution. The question is that you hear some political principles also talking about it. So which instrument are you using for import substitution? If you are to measure it over time, the inputs also must be known, right? That this is what we are driving at. So we have to agree on the inputs in order to really drive growth in the economy and value addition. Whether I call it import substitution, localization, industrialization, we must add value in the South African economy. And whether we will substitute that or leverage the opportunities at the regional level, it's something else. The same issue that I have, what I've studied is that, in order to develop the SMMEs, you have to link them to the global value chains. You can't develop small companies which are not linked to the value chain, and that should be our strategy. So key for me is coordination. Who's coordinating? All right. What's the role of institutions? The issue about municipalities, provinces, look at how much they're spending on economic infrastructure, which has declined, and we can see certain companies are moving from certain towns in the northwest because the infrastructure is not there. So what are we saying about that? All right. So if you are to drive industrialization, you can't not deal with the issue of municipalities and provinces and their expenditure in economic infrastructure. Lastly, for me, I think the same thinking on the master plan. We must prioritize as a country. What do you want? Which sectors do you want to develop? I agree that you cannot do everything. If you can have about 10 sectors as an example, which we all committed to driving, that will assist us. But if we are all over, unfortunately, we are not going to achieve much. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Tebogo. Neva, your responses to the questions and any concluding remarks, and then I'll do a 30-second wrap up at the end. Thanks, Neva.
Yeah, so I think just to pick up on a couple of issues, the region will always be critical for South Africa because we're a very small economy by global standards. So when we say we want to copy China, China has a quarter of the world's population, 20% of the world's population. India is right behind them. We tend to act as if a relatively small economy could do the same things as a very big one. But I think it's important to think through how we relate to the region on all of these issues, not just localization. The issue of local governments and industrialization applies across the board. It's not just localization, as you know. And part of the reason is that the Constitution is quite contradictory on the role of local government, because on the one hand, it's elected so people think it should be, addressing all of their problems. But in the Constitution, it has very limited economic powers and virtually no role in defining economic policy. So I think it's really important to be thinking through what kinds of platforms would help. And then just one specific thing for localization, this issue of how we define local is important. So localization in the mining charter is about supporting small towns where the mines are. That can actually get in the way of the bigger localization project if you're not careful by fragmenting efforts. And so if local governments start doing their own local procurement, meaning within the municipality, within the province, that can really lead to beggar my neighbor policies. I think we need to be careful about that. But I would argue just, that the real problem for localization is the same as the problem we have for industrial policy in general. And I would put it into 3 buckets. The first one is, traditionally we've all said, well, industrial policy, we need to focus on competitive manufacturing, which, by the way, comes very close to being just modernization theory. But anyways, but the problem is more competitive manufacturing in South Africa is not likely to lead to a huge increase in employment unless we manage to step up, the classic job creation industries in manufacturing, which is clothing, electronics, like consumer goods. And we've been completely unable to compete in those areas. And if we don't really say we want to step that up massively, then I think we need to start saying, well, what kinds of industries and activities will generate employment opportunities? And maybe with things like localization, except it's only ever going to be marginal, and look to where we can do it well. But I do think we need to be asking much more seriously, what is the structural change that would let us catch up with other upper middle income countries in terms of employment levels? Even within the paradigm that, industrial policy is about fine-tuning manufacturing, we're not very good at saying, what is the end state? What are the industries that will actually generate the growth and employment that we want and the opportunities we want, even if it's not going to solve all the problems we have? And then we could prioritize what products, what Nokwanda was saying, would help us prioritize and really get some products right. Whereas what we've kind of ended up doing, as people have said, is we sort of very scattershot, and we don't get any, we don't manage to build up any major industries. So I think that issue of saying, can we prioritize industries? It's very hard. You have to manage trade-offs. You have to manage lobbying. How do we think about that? And then finally, what comes up time and again is we've inherited these systems that were not designed to do what we want them to do. That applies to the procurement rules. It applies to the way retailers work. It applies to the way we've got the rent seekers, the way the particularly commodity value chains work in terms of upstream rent seeking. How do we think about the problem has always been there's a trade-off there between saying some people are benefiting from the system, but we need to disrupt it. How do we come up with a way to disrupt it which is viable and acceptable? And this is really where, for instance, with localization, Treasury is so worried about the price premium that they make it, and about corruption, that they make it almost impossible to do anything new and risky. So that issue of how do we actually promote innovation, given that we have systems that appear to have worked very well, it's just they were working very well to generate outcomes we don't want. And I think that applies to a whole range of issues in industrial policy, but specifically also to localization. Thank you, Saul.
Thanks very much. So my last comments to wrap up is to thank everyone. Thank you to the speakers and to the participants who were in the room and online. We had quite a number of people online, and also to the support team for getting everything working perfectly, and they've also arranged lunch for us. Who's in the room? I would not online, sorry. We'll send you a virtual sandwich. But thank you to everyone, and thank you for a great discussion. And the paper's online. This presentation will be online, and the various presentations from today and the YouTube videos will be available. Thanks, everyone, and see you at the next Development Dialogue.